Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to all of you. We are so delighted to host you in this virtual space today. So I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Kira Booth, an Associate Program Officer and Gender Focal Point for the National Ecosystems Assessment Initiative here at UNEP WCMC. Welcome to today's event on the Gender-Biodiversity Nexus. We're looking at how we can strengthen the integration of gender in the production and application of knowledge for biodiversity conservation. Today's event is brought to you by the National Ecosystem Assessment Initiative in collaboration with the Subglobal Assessment Network and co-hosted with the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service Network. So we have a very full and exciting agenda for you today. So let me tell you what's in store. We'll begin with opening remarks from the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service Network, our co-organizers for this event. We'll then move on to a presentation from the United Nations Development Programme on the UNDP Gender Equality Strategy. We'll hear a presentation from Ranalini Rai, coordinator of the Women for Biodiversity, on gender mainstreaming in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Next, we'll be moving on to the showcasing of stories from the field. So we'll start with UNDP Kazakhstan and their Mind the Step report, which is an experimental gender tool for pollinators-friendly value chain crops. Then we'll welcome our speakers from Colombia to present on the application of women's biocultural knowledge for science and policy in Colombia. Next, we'll move to Maria Eugenia from the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network, who will take the floor to tell us about Indigenous women and the co-production of knowledge. And finally, towards the end of the webinar, we'll host a question and answer session with our guest speakers. You're very welcome to share your questions and comments in the chat throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to address them as we go through. So for those who are joining us today for the first time, this webinar is hosted by the Subglobal Assessment Network in collaboration with the National Ecosystem Assessment Initiative at UNEP WCMC. The Subglobal Assessment Network is a community of practice that connects and supports individuals and organizations involved in subglobal ecosystem assessments. Members of the network include global practitioners, researchers, and decision makers who convene to share knowledge on biodiversity, ecosystem services, and its benefits for people. To learn more about the Subglobal Assessment Network and to see the recording of past events and stay up to date with future webinars, visit the link that will be posted in the chat. So let's get straight into it. I'll begin now by welcoming Yuko Karachi, who is the coordinator of the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service Network, who joins us today from Nairobi, Kenya, to give the opening remarks and introduce BES-Net's strategy for mainstreaming gender across their portfolio of work. Yuko, welcome to the floor.
Thank you, Kila, and good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody. On behalf of the BES-Net team, I'd like to once again welcome and thank all of you for joining this webinar as speakers, panelists, or participants. And then I'm pleased to see the large number of people registered to this meeting or attending this event today. And then your demonstrated interest clearly proves that the relevance of this topic. And it also reminds us of the critical importance of continuously deepening our understanding of the relationship and dynamics between biodiversity and gender, and enhancing our commitment to them. And before proceeding with the program, for those who may not be very familiar with our project, I would also like to share a brief overview of BES-Net. So next slide, please. BES-Net started in 2016 as a global initiative to complement and then contribute to the work of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES in short, with the support of the government of Germany and SweetBio. UNDP, UNEP, WCMC, and UNESCO work jointly as the BES-Net consortium. And then we all believe that concerted effort among science, policy, and in practice communities are imperative to build healthier and more resilient ecosystems. So we provide a menu of opportunities to enhance their collaborations at national, regional, and then global levels. For example, as you can see on the screen, by supporting the co-production of national ecosystem assessments, or co-designing and implementation of evidence-informed nature-based solutions using the project's catalytic best solution funds. We also support the close fertilization of expertise, experiences, and ideas at the trialogue events. And then also, we continuously support the dialogue and the knowledge exchange through the BES-Net online platforms. Next slide, please. And as we are implementing the project, we've been continuously seeking to embed gender into the DNA of the project, particularly by adopting a three-pillar approach as shown on this screen. Firstly, we are committed to mainstreaming gender perspectives across the project results framework in different work streams, and in tracking the progress with gender disaggregated indicators. Secondly, we prioritize adequate representation, not only by looking into the number of women, girls, or gender advocates participating in different activities, but also by trying to enhance the quality and an extent of their engagement, empowerment, and then subsequent contribution to the decisions and actions at different levels. Thirdly, making use of our network and online platforms, as I already mentioned, BES-Net strives to promote the sharing of knowledge, experience, and lesson with the partners or stakeholders on what works and then what does not work to mutually improve our practices. Therefore, this webinar today is indeed part of our partnership and awareness raising effort. And then we truly look forward to an active and productive interaction with you all present today. Next slide, please. And then we hope to maintain coordination and a continuous dialogue with like-minded individuals and organizations working in the field of biodiversity and in gender. So please visit our website and social media channels, subscribe to our newsletter, or connect to us for more information by using my email address. Thank you very much, and then have a great session today. And over to you, Kila. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuko, for those opening remarks. And this leads us nicely on to our next guests, Aurore and Kira from UNDP, who've joined us today to share UNDP's gender equality strategy. So I open the floor to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and very nice being here with everybody, with all of you. So yes, I'm Aurore Santiago, sitting in New York with the gender team, coordinating the work on inclusive economies, but also coordinating the development of the gender equality strategy. And Kira will be presenting with me, and she is the expert on environment, climate, and energy. So she will be delving into there. So this gender equality strategy was just presented to the executive board in June, and it was developed through an unprecedented process where we consulted more than 1,000 participants within UNDP and partners, and it went around two main questions. First, why progress towards gender equality has been so slow and scattered and even reversed? And the second, what UNDP can do best in response. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that we build from lessons learned from previous strategies. This is not the first UNDP gender equality strategy, but it is one that has elevated its ambition. So this one really aims to build on UNDP's value added, and previous evaluations and all the consultation told us that one of main UNDP's value added is to help governments to place gender equality at the core of policy negotiations, policy making, in environment, in economic development, in governance. This is one of main ambitions of this strategy, together with placing power relations and the transformation of social norms also at the core. If we continue to the next slide. I will not stop there. I will be sharing the links so you can also go through the long version, short version of the strategy. I will not stop here also on the global context, but we see that right now we are on unprecedented moments, and the strategy comes in a moment where we have the climate crisis, COVID-19, conflict, and evidence everywhere shows us that all these challenges are worse for women and pose challenges for gender equality. The Human Development Report of this year shows that for the first time in history, there is a global reversal on human development, but even worse for women. If we go to the next slide, we can see major objectives that UNDP is presenting by 2025. This is the first time that we present such ambitious objectives. So we are not building this from scratch. This comes from work that UNDP has already been doing and performing. So we build on what is working well. 2/3 of UNDP programs already contribute to gender equality. And we see that this is a way to go, placing gender equality at the core of UNDP major programming. But then we have also initiated work in other areas that we identified that are where UNDP has a value added, like working on finance, or this scaling up work on energy to support 250 million women getting access to and use productively energy. So if we go to the next slide, we see here 3 directions of change that are the same directions of change of UNDP's strategic plan. So our gender equality strategy cannot be in a vacuum. So it builds on the strategic plan, and it explains and specifies how UNDP's strategic plan will contribute to gender equality, and at the same time, how gender equality is going to accelerate the objectives of UNDP's strategic plan. So we have 3 directions of change, and we aim to achieve structural transformation by shifting power structures and the economic, social, and political systems that perpetuate discrimination. This is where the raised ambition is. So it is not, so there is an effort not to do piecemeal solutions, not to work here and there, but really target the structural discrimination that lies behind the systems, economic system, political system, social system. And we are also making a stronger effort on intersectional approaches to leaving no one behind, understanding with a more complex analysis the intersectionalities of inequalities and discrimination, and also with a stronger effort on working on crisis contexts and helping build resilience. If we go to the next slide, we are building also on our existing partnerships, but there's in this strategy a special emphasis on engaging with feminist organizations and women movements. So this strategy acknowledges their critical role, not only to shift policy, but also to achieve change that lasts longer. So women's organizations have been the real game changers throughout history. So there is an emphasis to build more strongly these relations, and also to engage with those partners that influence and determine social norms. This includes religious organizations, influencers, and alike, and the media. If we go to the next slide, here you have the priorities. In this slide, these are the UNDP priorities towards gender equality. These are built around our signature solutions, and they are, like I mentioned before, some existing priorities that we are bringing from before, that we know that are working well, and that UNDP is showing a value added. But also we are adding new objectives and new priorities, building on current context and also on UNDP's opportunities, possibilities. So we combine Also, the short-term changes that attends immediate needs with these more longer terms addressing structural barriers and aiming to transform these structural changes. So we do have, as you can see, 5 signature solutions: poverty and equality, governance, resilience, environment, energy, where we integrate strongly gender equality. And we have concrete priorities and these priorities are common objectives between gender specialists and specialists on these fields. And then we have a standalone signature solution on gender equality, which aims to, which includes the priorities that accelerate gender equality and where UNDP offers comparative advantages. If we go to the next slide, we see here the 3 enablers that we use to achieve these priorities mentioned before, like, for example, on finance, the gender team and the SDG Finance Hub of UNDP, we have a joint offer, joint programming to redirect development finance towards gender equality. Next slide, please. Here, I will not stop either, but I will just mention that the gender equality strategy establishes these priorities in the programming and policy sphere, but also identifies how UNDP needs to keep transforming internally to be ready to achieve these objectives. So we do also have a full plan to ensure that we have the capacities, the leadership, the accountability, everything in place, the financing in place internally to achieve these objectives. So if we go to the next slide, then I will pass the floor to Kira so she can talk more in detail on the priorities on environment and energy. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Aroa, and it's wonderful to be here. So I'm excited to have this conversation because this is such an important nexus, and UNDP's updated gender equality strategy does offer these entry points for advancing gender equality through nature, climate, and energy work. And of course, more and more we see gender priorities being integrated and prioritized in environment and climate financing mechanisms and in environment agreements like the Convention for Biodiversity work, which we'll hear more about. And even something as important as the Sustainable Development Goals didn't really get at this nexus and offer us entry points for gender equality advancement and environment climate areas. So it's really exciting that UNDP's done this in its gender equality strategy more. So we see some points on the slide, and I think it helps to understand a little bit about what that could look like in practice. So I'll just share a few kind of broad results areas that we see at UNDP that relate to what we're seeing in this strategy. And this is work underway in countries and that can be scaled up, certainly. So increasing women's leadership and decision-making around natural resource management and promoting women's equal engagement in local, regional, sectoral, national processes is really key. So this could look like working with communities to develop quotas for women and men in local management committees and protected area committees, for example, doing related leadership and management capacity building to make that happen, and then ensuring that women hold those decision-making positions in the committee. Closing gender gaps in natural resource management. So things like improving land rights, land use, land tenure for women, shaping processes and related policy and gender norms to facilitate and improve women's use, access, control of land, water, renewable energy resources, forests and fisheries, transport, technology, and providing that related support to raise awareness of all stakeholders involved in this and the importance long-term sustainability and importance of assisting women in exercising their legal rights and priorities in natural resource management. Gender responsive policy and planning support is really key, I think, around ecosystems and biodiversity conservation. There are key places for this at the national level. We're seeing this more and more in plans such as the nationally determined contribution, bringing in a nature lens and also a gender equality lens. And there are other important plans, for example, NBSAP, net-related national communications, that more and more are integrating gender equality and local community priorities, and also bringing in disaggregated and gender responsive data. Aroa touched on the importance of supporting women's groups and collective action, and I think that's really important in the biodiversity sphere. So, for example, supporting women's collective engagement in producer organizations, self-help groups, cooperatives, labor unions, outgrow schemes, linking to financing, to markets, and of course, at the individual and collective and community level, supporting nature, positive, sustainable livelihoods is another really important area. So I think I'll stop there. I'm really looking forward to hearing from country and project teams on their firsthand experience on this work. And of course, I'll be around to engage in questions and discussion. Over for me, thank you.
Thank you, Kira and Aurora. And UNDP's gender equality strategy certainly sets a strong precedence for how we can systematically and critically address gender equality in large and complex institutional contexts. So staying now on the theme of gender mainstreaming, I'm delighted to announce our keynote presenter, Mrinalini Rai, who is the Director of Women for Biodiversity, who's been working tirelessly with colleagues and advocates for gender equality around the world to ensure action on gender equality is properly embedded in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is due to be adopted at the 15th Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity in December. Mrinalini, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the floor to tell us about the journey of mainstreaming gender in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework.
Thank you so much, Kira. I hope everybody can hear me. Apologies if there's an echo, and hopefully I'll be able to retain the internet connection. So thank you very much for this invitation to join this amazing webinar and to also share some of the key progresses or elements which we are looking into, in particular to the gender considerations in the CBD's post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Next slide, please. So I looked at the UNDP strategy, and I also looked at the concept note, and I think it'd be really very important to kind of draw to attention some of the key elements that we are really looking to address. So I'm now going to go through the whole paragraph. But of course, we always talk about gender equality and what does it really mean. Now, I wanted to also give this, so I have been asked specifically to talk about the gender considerations in the post-2020, so I will kind of focus on that part. But this, so what we have is that we are trying to work around the post-2020 that is going to be adopting this blue framework, this whole blueprint for looking at how we live in harmony with nature. Our argument is that you cannot live in harmony with nature if you don't address equality, equity, rights of half of the world's population, which is made up of women. So at the last COP, I always leave loose track because we've lost 2 years. So this is last COP is about 4 years ago in 2018 in Sharm el-Sheikh, where the COP decided that the process of the post-2020 would be guided by this set of principles. There are 13 principles. So one of the principles that we were able to push for is that the process and the working of the post-2020 would be gender responsive. And so been trying to work around how that would actually be in action or in particularly embedded into the working of the working group on the post-2020 and the whole process ongoing. So I just want to kind of clarify like what some of the documents in the CBD has talked about. So it has elaborated some of the element of how the post-2020 could possibly be gender responsive, is saying that promoting gender equality and women's empowerment, but also understanding that also means that to also provide them equal opportunities for men and women to also derive social besides the economic benefits. So I'm going to come more onto that. Next slide, please. So I want to set it up because this report has been talked about since 2019 and is still also really very relevant. So some of the key aspects that, and thank for the presentation on the strategy, is we have talked about, or the strategy has talked about the solution for that you're talking about the environment, but we also really need to see is this is just a graphic, the whole encompasses what is really needed, is that there are indirect drivers, but they're also directors, but the leveraging points. So one of the leveraging point is that we really need to also address inequalities. And I would also really like, I'm coming from the biodiversity side, so I would really like to also say that when we're talking about natural resources and talking about the role of women in management of natural resources, what is one really very key element to understand is, as you talked about, is governance. Governance boils down to basically very fundamental right of women's rights to the lands and territories. If they have that, then they can be part of the decision making, then they can be part of the voices can be heard much more actively. One of the key elements also to address this has also been finance. So as we talk about, and I want to open the space also for all of us to also follow, is we're always talking about the climate. We also really need to see it from a different perspective, saying that climate is there, but also what's really happening. You can also talk about the link with, the COVID or the One Health approach, is saying that it's also driven by biodiversity loss that also impacts how the burdens of biodiversity loss impacts women, in particular to indigenous and local women all around the world. And also understanding that one of the key elements, as you talked about as an enabler and also identified, is to say that yes, there is climate finance, but we also really need to start looking at biodiversity finance. This is something I'm saying because this is part of the big discussions on the post-2020 discussions. Next slide, please. Sorry if I'm going too fast. So, okay, there were some of the key elements that I think we really should note about. There's a lot of discussion and a lot of different thematic agendas, which is embedded in the biodiversity. So as you all know, the CBD, the Convention on the Biological Diversity, is one of the sisters of the Rio Conventions beside the UNCCC, where there's a lot of focus, of course, on the UNCCD, which does not get so much notice. So we are kind of in the middle. So one of the things we always also want to start off with saying that there are 3 pillars of the Biodiversity Convention. We always focus on the conservation part of it. There are 2 other pillars of the CBD. One is sustainable use, and the other one is access and benefit sharing. And I'm pointing this out because these 2 other pillars are really very important for women, because they are the ones, resource users, they are the ones who also have the traditional knowledge, and they're also the one who know a lot of these genetic knowledge about the biodiversity. So now what is the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework? It is a global strategic plan for biodiversity being developed under the CBD, the Convention of Biological Diversity. It is a global agreement that will define global actions to address biodiversity loss for the next decade. So there are milestones for 2030, but the vision is like is a vision for 2050. It will also replace and hopefully improve the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 and 2020, which is basically also, people may be familiar with when they talk about the ICHA targets. So the strategic plan had 20 ICHA targets. So this is what's been doing. And if you look at the timeline, 2020 was the end of the strategic plan. So the COP15, which was supposed to actually happen in 2020, was to have had this plan. But because of the COVID, we haven't had the meeting, and hence hopefully we will have it finally at the end of this year in Montreal. Next slide, please. Now setting the stage of what a little bit of the background and the focus of the post-2020, I'm going back on the gender context within the CBD. This is very important for us, and our advocacy around has been that you have a COP decision that asks you to be gender responsive in the whole making of the global biodiversity framework, but also in the preambular text of the convention, you will also, there's this explicit mention of the role and the role of women. We're also recognizing that they should also be the part of the process, but also the implementation of the work of the convention. So we are still having that aspiration that this will be done. So next slide, please. Now, within that, so you have that in the preambular text of the CBD. Then you also have what's called the CBD and the Gender Plan of Action. So at COP 2014 in Pyeongchang, but also to realize one thing, though the work of the gender may be a bit slower, but CBD is the first Rio Convention to actually have had a gender plan of action. So this gender plan of action was also adopted in 2014. This plan was for 2015 and to tie up with the strategic plan until 2020. And while we are also engaged in our different spaces, looking at the goals, the targets, and the other work of the development of the post-2020, one of the very crucial important elements to also consider or keep in mind is that along with the global biodiversity framework, there is also the work of this plan will also be updated. So the work on the post-2020 gender plan of action, which will also be another decision of the COP at the COP15. Next slide, please. So what has happened so far? As you all know, the negotiations in person stopped, but a lot of the virtual meetings still took place. However, there was the condition that we have to meet in person. So after a 2-year gap, the last being in 2019 in February, where the working group 2020 took place, the second session, we were only meeting up this year in February. So the working group took place in Geneva in March, which also had 2 other meetings together, the SBSTA, the implementation, and the technical aspect, the SBI and the SBSTA meetings. Now, in that meeting, it was the first time that we were able to come and actually engage and meet and look at the text. And then there was also and then after that, so far has been they couldn't finish the work there, but we also had the Working Group 2020 4th session in Nairobi. Next slide, please. Okay, so now what happened? So I want to take the process between 2 years we did not meet up. The first time we met up in March and in Nairobi. So in the process of 2 years ago in Rome, the Women's Caucus had proposed the need for a standalone target on gender equality. That was in the report, but was really not officially taken up. We worked with some of our parties, especially in Costa Rica, who were able to propose this. So it came in the post-2020 working document. So when it was first opened up of course, besides all the virtual meetings in Geneva, we really campaigned around that there is a need and addressing all the work that had been done, the decisions and all that. we were able to mobilize. So until Geneva, the way the text was that there were 21 targets, and target 22 was in brackets. Brackets means that it was a considerations under the section of new target proposal. So we really lobbied for that in Geneva, saying that, we really can't miss this opportunity. And you have an obligation. You recognize in the 92 preamble that they are, and this is a way to ensure that women are active, not only actively engaged. So, in a very quick snapshot, so we ran this, and in Geneva, we got the support of the GRULAC, headed also by Costa Rica, and we also had a lot of other party support, and an agreement that's saying that, yes, there is a need for a standalone target on gender equality. This for me is really very important because I would want to, using all these spaces, to also share that when we're talking about the global biodiversity framework, does not have 21 targets, but officially actually has 22 targets. And the 22 target 22, is on gender equality. So going back just 2 months after that in Nairobi, we gathered more support. And so there is now a target 22, and we have parties engaged in this process. And now we also have proposals for the text. Next slide, please. Yeah, 2 more minutes. So I just wanted to give everybody just a look at what the proposal looks like. So this is from the open-ended working group 4th session report on the contact group 4 that discussed the target 22. And through the Women's Caucus, we have been having engagements and virtual consultations with our members to see the language that we may want to propose going up to COP15. So that is an internal process that we are doing. So we have a proposed draft compilation of all this, and we hope to work a little bit more on it. We are having still ongoing consultations. But what happened in Nairobi was that there was a proposal. So if you look at the target 22, the parties proposed those targets, but there were also an alternative targets proposal for the text for target 22. So there were specifically by UK and Norway. And if you look at the alternative target for 22, it's a kind of compilation, but I think there was the coordination was the rapporteur combined them, but we had worked with the parties and we had worked. So this slide I'm sharing with you is what we also had, that UK and Norway's clean text, which they had read out at the plenary for people's reference and sharing that this was it. Next slide, please. Another one on the back slide. If you look at the photograph, I support a gender equality target. I also want to say that one of our campaign was also like giving flowers. So we had this called Gender Champions. So all the parties who supported us, both the sessions, we were giving out flowers and thanking them. And this became really very popular. And I think this was also always supported. Parties looked to get these flowers, and we were like, you supported, you know, because there were a lot of parties who were sympathetic and agreed to that. And we were like, okay, you say it on the plenary, and then you shall get this flower. Next slide. So this is very briefly, I will not have a lot of time to go into that, but just I think it ties up to the event and the strategy. I just want to say that the focus of the Global Biodiversity Framework is the whole 22 targets. Of course, we want targets 22, but also understanding that it's really very important to also address the other elements, which we also need to make sure is gender responsive. So one of them is the planning, monitoring, reporting process. And I think a colleague from the Undp had talked about the NDCs. One of the key elements for our engagement at the national level, considering that if you all are at the national level, will be the NBSAP. the national biodiversity and strategy plans that everybody will start doing this after the COP in December. And one of the key elements, an update on that also is that there is Jeff Global Environment Facility has allocated $43 million to support about 139 countries, developing countries, to support with their NBSAP. This will water down to all your national work, and this will be a process to please stay engaged with. And if I'm not mistaken, considering that usually for the NBSAP is with the UNDP, which kind of coordinates that. So I think it'll be very important. NDC is there, but for biodiversity, the NBSAPs becomes a very key document to follow up with. And of course, the implementation support mechanism. One of the key implementation support mechanisms which you're really fighting for is finance. You're talking about participation, you're talking about implementation. That does not happen if you really do not make sure that there is gender responsive budgeting within the financial mechanism. So there are two things being discussed under the CBD. One is a financial mechanism, and the other one is a resource mobilization. So all this work that you also really need to do also needs to make sure that to implement that biodiversity post 2020, you also need to have that budget allocation for Indigenous, direct access for Indigenous peoples and local communities, for women's organization. And once again, I'm reiterating, like, your lessons learned was that it's the women's organizations, feminist groups, movements who are making this progress. So this is where the support comes from. And my last slide, sorry, one more slide. These are just some resources that I'm just sharing with you on the reports. Sorry, one slide up, please. Will be helpful, and I'm happy, and I think after this, the organizers can also, I've embedded everything in the presentation, is looking at, so we're also looking at the rights-based approach. Again, there are so many elements that we are focusing on. Of course, we're talking about women's rights and women's empowerment. We're also talking human rights. We always say women's rights are human rights. So we are tying up also this work with the recent resolution. We've been following that on the right to a healthy environment. And so we're using that process also to ensure that when we're talking about rights, you're talking about the right to a healthy environment, you also really need to make sure that the rights of women are also addressed within it. These are some helpful resources. One is our report that we took out to see how throughout the process, different elements, finance, reporting, capacity building, NBSAP could be gender responsive. Then a report from there's a human rights working group where we are part of. And of course, the collaborative work of the OCHAR office, the UNEP, WCMC, who's also co-hosting this event, and UN Women on how human rights and the environment and the gender equality could also, and there are some principles within it. And next slide, please. I just wanted to also just give a glimpse of it. I won't just go into that. This is really very key important. Also understanding that this year, all the three processes have either been done. The UNCCD just took place a couple of months ago. You have an upcoming UNCCC in Sharm el-Sheikh, and then you have the CBD COP. And this is what we're talking about. We talk about gender responsiveness, and they all do agree to that. They also need to be building the synergies and getting the same messages and building up the ambitions on gender equality within all three processes, including the other MEAs. Next slide, please. What's next? Next slide. If you can just keep going. Yeah. So again, I just want to give a glimpse. This is just a timeline of the meeting. Of the December will happen, the COP15 was going to take place, and I just want to give a glimpse of people if they wanted to also follow some of the other upcoming meetings. And one last slide. Next, please. So what we are planning to do, and I'm really hoping if you can check out our webpage or you want to reach out to us, please. I think this is, again, taking out also from your own report on lessons learned. So we just 2 days ago put this campaign up. She shapes biodiversity. It is a photo contest. And what we're really doing is that we're asking for photographs. You will see this if you go more on the webpage, because we really want to showcase these good practices, women-led conservation, sustainable use, access benefit sharing, any aspect that you feel. So if there are members here, groups here, please feel free to check this out. Next slide, please. Just saying that again, women's land rights are fundamental. That is one of the key asks for us in the target, but also saying that, talking about a healthy environment. Healthy environment also means living in dignity, and women have that right to live in dignity. So really need to make sure that they have a right to culture, health, self-determination, and right to life. And the last slide. This is our information. This is our website. Please check it out. And our contacts, please feel free to reach out. And I'm here. I'll be here for the session to take any queries, questions, and please feel free to also join. We have a Women's Caucus mailing list, which you can find on the webpage. If you're interested to engage in CBD, or you're coming there, you want to get in touch with us, please subscribe. And we're also having our preparatory meetings, and you're most welcome to join in. So having said that, I'll leave it here. So thank you so much for the time. And my apologies that I know I did go over time a little bit, but this is really engaging. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrinalini, for grounding us in all of the activities and challenges and the path forwards for mainstreaming gender in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And we really find ourselves in a critical moment in the lead up to the adoption of the framework in December, which sets out not only what we need to do, but almost more critically, how we need to do it. And specifically how we ensure that everyone is equally able to participate in and benefit from policies and actions to protect biodiversity. So thank you so much for your presentation. And we'll now move straight on to our segment of the webinar, in which we'll be showcasing stories from the field. So 2 of BES-Net's country partners are here with us today to share their experiences of gender mainstreaming in their respective projects. So we're delighted, firstly, to welcome BES-Net's partners in Kazakhstan to share their case study on the use of gender analysis for value chain crops. So Gorka and Ison, you are welcome to take the floor.
Thank you, Kira. I'm glad to be here with you today. My name is Ayjan, and I'm a program associate in Undp. On behalf of Undp, we prepared a presentation, it will be presented by me and my colleague, Gauhar, gender specialist. So the presentation we prepared is on an experimental gender tool for pollinators-friendly value chain crops in Kazakhstan. Can we move to the next slide, please? Well, Kazakhstan is the 9th largest country in the world, and more than 5% of the country's land surface has a protected area designation. Okay, next slide, please. The flora of agricultural biodiversity is represented by 226 species of wild crop relatives. The flora of Kazakhstan has more than 6,000 species of trees, shrubs, and herbaceous vegetation. Of this, about 1,500 are medicinal plants. One of the challenges in this area is the unregulated use of medicinal plants. As demand in foreign markets increases, the volume of uncontrolled collection of medicinal plants also grows, which in turn leads to the depletion of raw materials, and in the future, an imbalance in the ecosystems. Next slide, please. Thank you. Women in Kazakhstan make up slightly more than half of the country's total population, but their contribution to economic performance growth and wealth is well below their potential. In the 2022 World Economic Forum gender gap ranking, Kazakhstan has made a breakthrough in many areas. At the same time, the extent to which women can enjoy the benefits of the economic development of any country depends on their position in their labor market. The percentage of self-employed women in agriculture is 38.7%. At the same time, the gender gap pay gap constitutes 23%. The unemployment rate among rural women is highest among women between 29 and 36 years old and is 8.1%. While for men from the same age group, it is 5.9%. Women in rural areas believe that the most difficult obstacle for them is finding a job. Next slide, please. Okay, so we prepared one question, not one, but the question for you. So it's a poll, and please have a chance to answer. Well, the question is, what is the percentage of women managers in agriculture in Kazakhstan? And please choose. Well, can we move? Did everybody vote? Okay. So the right answer is, okay. The percentage of women managers in agriculture in Kazakhstan is only 14.8% of managers in agriculture are women. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Well, as a part of the project, integration and analysis of the gender dimensions was carried out. The toolkit developed on gender equality provides environmental professionals with concrete examples, illustrates different dynamics of gender equality, and takes a step-by-step approach to gender mainstreaming. We developed this tool to identify key gender gaps and challenges, and find and address and to find out how can we address these challenges. So about this tool, I want to invite my colleague Gauhar to continue to talk about this. Gauhar, please.
Thank you, Ayjan. And greetings to all participants and panelists. Thank you for this chance to share our experience. So let me please, next slide, please. So this Mind Your Step gender toolkit was developed, as you see, because of the circumstances in which women are left out in the pollinated friendly crops supply chain. So there are 4 ways how we are actually seeing this process to be organized. The first step is mapping gender roles, and I will be talking about them in detail further. Identifying social-cultural determinants, also looking at the interlinkages between value chain performance, and the final step is designing gender-smart value chains. Next slide, please. So this map out, step one is to map out the differentiated roles assigned to both women and men along BES-Net compliant value chain. So first stage, so there was a, I will be referring to our research conducted during this project. During the first stage, we found out that while women may not be excluded from the meetings and consultation stage, field investigations conducted with target groups in Kazakhstan suggest that men are usually assigned the roles of participating in negotiations, making decisions and agreements. And such limitations, of course, and biases can limit women's roles in negotiations and their influence in the subsequent decision-making processes. Another second stage was to look at the input provision, production and harvesting. For example, in Kazakhstan, common licorice grows abundantly in the wild on government leased collection areas, and collectors may travel for long distances and camp in wilderness during the harvest season. Field investigations showed more women engaged in the harvesting and processing and transportation of licorice. So similarly, most of the images published online show one or several men among collectors. The next stage was to look at the processing, transportation, and export. Processing includes the extraction of ingredients, evaporation, grinding, compacting, mixing, and filling. So although women and men are equally responsible, for different tasks and duties performed during the stage. There were 4 of 10 respondents, 3 which are women, who see at least some difference in the hardship levels of the task. Women tend to be less represented among brokers, agents, and salespersons. And the last stage, which is research and development commercialization, we looked at some companies who are involved in R&D, and this data from pharmaceutical companies and beverage industries show that while there are more women involved in R&D processes, experts in herbal formulations, men tend to dominate in senior management positions. And survey-based investigations also revealed that women perform various lab and diagnosis tasks. However, in terms of numbers, usually most of the employees are men. Next slide, please. Step 2 is to identify in your context the social and cultural determinants that limit women's effective participation to BES-Net compliant value chains. So specifically in Kazakhstan, gender roles are influenced heavily by cultural norms and can vary across contexts. For example, rural and urban, and some religious traditions can have impact on women's rights in education. That is why initiating an IPBES mechanisms, for instance, is more likely to be done by men, while women are expected to contribute to its implementation. So this differentiation of roles along the value chain can be explained also by other factors related to health, family, and well-being. Next, please. Now we have another question, and maybe we'll be gathering answers and I'll be continuing on my presentation. But question is, how much do you think is the share of women from rural areas among members of households with low income? So maybe while poll is, people are answering, participants are answering, maybe we could move on with presentation, right? Yes, so there's a question. So basically, So there was a question. Now the next slide was the answer. So basically, it's about that the share of women from rural areas among members of households with low income makes 52%. There was a question that what this is about. It's about women poverty that we observe in Kazakhstan, that rural women, their category, they are the high level of poverty among rural women. So this is quite an issue. So that is why it's very important to apply these gender toolkits and engage them at the early stage. Next slide, please. So step 3 is to notice these interlinkages between gender and overall performance. Interestingly, survey-based investigations revealed positive interlinkages between the overall performance of the value chain and the level of women's participation. Increasing numbers of women along the value chain play a role working as brokers, agents, and sales representatives, and tend to be correlated with the level of discipline and organization. In fact, women's participation in the value chain has led to more sales and profitability. And another interesting finding is that gender balanced teams tend to outperform men-dominated teams in terms of effectiveness and performance. Next slide, please. So now it's the final step to design gender smart BES-Net compliant value chains. So you see from this that first we need to recognize the vital role of women in the pollinator-friendly value chain crops, like within team and when we are working with our stakeholders. Then we need to promote knowledge on the processing and storage of pollinator-friendly crops, establishing long-lasting contracts with private sector companies, and also looking at these companies also is very important, how like whether the composition and the gender balance in those companies. So basically, gender mainstreaming along IPBES and BES-Net compliant value chains should be given a due priority to ensure that both women and men fully benefit from the innovative potential of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. So while designing different BES-Net interventions, the vital roles of women along the value chain should be recognized while offering the appropriate space to express their consent prior to any attempt to access their knowledge and biological or genetical resources. So this is the issue of ethics and consent, right? Next, please. After this study and after this field visits and talking to different stakeholders, we came up with this several recommendations. I would like to highlight just maybe a couple of them. That first of all, of course, that's obvious that promoting gender equality contributes to increasing productivity, and also that the best result indicators can be achieved when a working team has a balanced representation of women and men. And supporting and providing with appropriate social conditions such as part-time working possibilities, provision of transportation and decent pay, etc. So now I would like to give the floor to Ayjan to finish our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gauhar. We came to the following conclusion after this analysis, and you can see it on the presentation. Can you please move to the next slide? Thank you very much. Well, as a result, the gender mainstreaming along the pollinator-friendly crops value chain components should be given a due priority. The second is there are more women engaged in the harvesting and processing of traditional herbs, and women are less represented among brokers, agents, and salespersons involved in the value chain in the country. Third one, given that value chain products using pollinator crops involve performing tasks in agricultural environment, it is important to take into account the socio-cultural determinants that have a huge impact on the expectations of women. And the last one is many traditional crops such as eco rice and ryegrass value is dependent on men's labor force when it comes to managing the traditional herbs and negotiating their utilization. So this is the summary of our presentation. Thank you very much. And the floor is given to their
Yes, thank
Kira.
you.
Yeah.
If you have questions, we'll be happily answering them in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gorka and Izan. And yes, just to reiterate, you are very welcome, of course, to share your questions in the chat. Please go ahead and do that. And thank you so much for presenting your fascinating case study. And we'll move, because we're a little bit limited with time, we'll move straight on to our partners in Colombia to share their experience regarding the role and application of women's biocultural knowledge in their national ecosystem assessment. So I welcome Carolina to take the floor.
Muchas gracias por la invitación a ser parte de este webinario. La siguiente, por favor. Next, please. Thank you. Entonces, un poquito voy, a través de esta presentación corta, voy a introducir a las dos personas que nos van a acompañar con el estudio de caso para Colombia. Solamente quiero hacer referencia que Colombia en el 2021 publicó la Evaluación Nacional de Biodiversidad y Servicios Ecosistémicos, que consta de 7 capítulos. Siguiente, por favor. Y que fue el resultado. Next, please. La siguiente, por favor. Thank you. Y que fue el resultado de un trabajo colaborativo entre más de 130 investigadores del país. Esta evaluación pues siguió los lineamientos establecidos por la IPBES para realizar este tipo de evaluaciones, y el objetivo de la evaluación era contar con información estratégica sobre el estado y tendencias de la biodiversidad para la toma de decisiones. La evaluación, como les comenté, fue publicada en el 2020 y tiene un horizonte de trabajo del 2005 hasta el 2050. En el marco de esta evaluación, el capítulo 4, siguiente por favor, fue dedicado exclusivamente a abordar el tema de la diversidad biocultural, conocimientos y prácticas para el cuidado de la vida en territorios indígenas y comunidades locales. En este capítulo, la siguiente panelista que vamos a invitar, Edith Bastidas, presentó un estudio de caso sobre el papel de las mujeres en la conservación de la bioculturalidad. Edith, entonces, nos envió un video. Edith es una mujer indígena perteneciente al pueblo de Los Pastos del departamento de Nariño, es abogada, es especialista en Derecho Constitucional y está haciendo un PhD en Derecho. Es miembro de la Red de Mujeres Indígenas sobre Biodiversidad de América Latina y el Caribe, y va a contar un poco cómo fue su proceso, o su experiencia como coordinadora del capítulo sobre diversidad biocultural en la evaluación de biodiversidad y servicios ecosistémicos de Colombia, y también nos va a hablar cuáles son las aproximaciones del país frente a la inclusión del tema de género en los procesos de conservación. Y la siguiente intervención lo va a realizar Fanny, siguiente por favor, que también está conectada. Fanny es líder del pueblo indígena Huitioto de la Amazonía colombiana, también es abogada, es magíster en estudios políticos internacionales, tiene una alta experiencia en conocimientos y trabajo con pueblos indígenas de Colombia y especialmente con la Amazonía colombiana. Actualmente es coordinadora del programa de Mujer, Niñez y Familia de la Organización Nacional de los Pueblos Indígenas de la Amazonía Colombiana, OPIAC. Es comisionada del OPIAC en la Comisión Nacional de Mujeres dentro de la Mesa Permanente de Concertación y consejera de la Coordinación de Mujer y Familia de la Coordinadora de la Organización Indígena la Cuenca Amazónica COICA, organización que trabaja con los 9 países de la cuenca amazónica. Entonces Fanny también nos va a hablar sobre cuál es el rol de la mujer en la conservación de la biodiversidad, específicamente para la Amazonía colombiana, y a través de su intervención, su intervención es muy importante porque visibilizaremos en campo, en terreno, cuál es este rol de la mujer y cómo se vive desde estas redes de mujeres, la intervención de la mujer en procesos de conservación de la biodiversidad. Entonces, sin más preámbulos, pues le damos la bienvenida al video que nos envió Edith. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias por la invitación a este webinario sobre un tema tan importante como es la incorporación de la perspectiva de género en la biodiversidad y los servicios ecosistémicos. Creo que este evento es muy oportuno, teniendo en cuenta que actualmente en el marco de la Convención de Diversidad Biológica se está discutiendo el nuevo marco de diversidad posterior a 2020 y las cuestiones de género parece que se están quedando relegadas un poco a veces en estas negociaciones. Sabemos pues que el tema de género es amplio, es complejo, pero creemos también que es necesario hacer lo posible para incorporar este debate en todos los asuntos relacionados con la diversidad. Para nuestro caso, hablamos de manera más específica desde la perspectiva de las mujeres indígenas. Trabajamos con la Red de Mujeres Indígenas sobre Biodiversidad de América Latina y el Caribe, y también con base en la experiencia que tenemos a nivel local, nacional, internacional, y especialmente también como cocoordinadora que me desempeñé en el capítulo sobre diversidad biocultural, en la evaluación que se hizo en Colombia sobre diversidad y servicios ecosistémicos. Este informe ya está disponible. Empezaré diciendo entonces que para nosotras, como mujeres, el papel de la mujer en la conservación de la diversidad y del conocimiento es obvio. Sin embargo, parece que en los diferentes escenarios no es tan obvio o se le resta la importancia. Por este motivo, pues es bueno recordar que en las diferentes culturas la mujer tiene un papel definitivo en la preservación del conocimiento, del territorio y pues por lo tanto en la pervivencia física y cultural de cada pueblo. La mujer en los pueblos indígenas es educadora, es alimentadora, es médica y sanadora, guardiana del territorio. Sus nuevos roles actualmente son como lideresa ambiental y pues de manera especial como poseedora y transmisora del conocimiento y la memoria colectiva de su pueblo. Sin embargo, este papel ha sido invisibilizado por diferentes formas de violencia y discriminación, entre ellas el machismo, el racismo, por ejemplo, y pues valga decir que la mujer indígena está sufriendo toda esta discriminación de forma más grave que la mujer en general. Esto a pesar de que Colombia, pues en el caso de nuestro país, ha adoptado varios instrumentos internacionales que están comprometidos con frenar la discriminación contra la mujer, pero pues su implementación ha sido muy precaria y tristemente pues sucede algo muy parecido en otros países de la región y en general del mundo. También pues hay instrumentos internacionales, por ejemplo en el marco de la Conferencia de las Partes del Convenio de Diversidad Biológica del año 2014, se adoptó el Plan de Acción de Género, con acciones que podían desarrollar los países y la Secretaría para integrar justamente la perspectiva de género en la aplicación del convenio. Igual que otras normas sobre las mujeres, pues este plan fue muy poco implementado. En el caso de Colombia, pues la gran mayoría de los informes iban con ningún avance en avances, digamos, en materia de género. Bueno, por otra parte, pues hay que mencionar que es bueno contar con información, con estadísticas claras para estos informes y para todo tipo de políticas y normas, pero la información pues es muy escasa en relación con las mujeres, especialmente con la mujer rural y con la mujer indígena, pero la poca información con la que se cuenta permite evidenciar que la mujer definitivamente está en desventaja incluso frente al hombre rural en la toma de decisiones, en la propiedad y la cantidad de la tierra, en asistencia técnica y bueno, en los diferentes aspectos. Y pues hay que decir que la mujer indígena es la mayormente afectada por la pérdida de diversidad, porque como dijimos anteriormente, pues cumple diferentes papeles que se ven afectados. Por ejemplo, se escasea la medicina, todo lo que ella necesita para hacer la medicina propia, todo lo que ella necesita para sus recetas tradicionales y para el alimento tradicional. Lo mismo pues se afecta el territorio para las ceremonias tradicionales y espirituales. Y en últimas pues todo esto lo está sufriendo pues sí, toda la población indígena, pero mayormente la mujer. Asimismo se ha sabido pues creo que de todos es conocido que varias lideresas ambientales, defensoras del territorio, sufren muchas formas de violencia, han sido asesinadas, han sido desplazadas, desaparecidas, también víctimas de violencia sexual, y la impunidad es alta en estos casos. Sin embargo, pues ante toda esta situación desalentadora, las mujeres siguen llevando a cabo experiencias de conservación y de recuperación, inclusive de la diversidad y el conocimiento, incluso experiencias de acciones para la mitigación y adaptación del cambio climático, a través de recuperación de tejidos, de semillas, de técnicas agrícolas, calendarios agrícolas, preparación de recetas tradicionales, de medicamentos, otras actividades de ecoturismo y, bueno, muchas formas de gestión territorial que ellas están liderando, con escasos recursos generalmente de cooperación internacional. Así que creemos pues que es necesario garantizar los derechos de las mujeres, garantizar su participación en todas las políticas y normas y en general pues en todo lo que sea necesario para reducir esta brecha en la que se encuentran las mujeres actualmente. Y justamente en el marco de las negociaciones del nuevo marco de diversidad posterior a 2020 está una propuesta de la Meta 22 que se refiere específicamente a las mujeres, pero su texto todavía no ha sido aprobado, lo cual pues nos causa mucha sorpresa y digamos pues mucha tristeza, porque creemos que el reconocimiento del papel de la mujer debe ser un imperativo ético en todos los asuntos relacionados con la diversidad y el conocimiento. Así que pues como resumen diré entonces primero que el papel de la mujer es muy importante en la conservación de la diversidad y el conocimiento. Segundo, que la mujer es la mayormente afectada con la pérdida de diversidad del conocimiento, el cambio climático y todas las situaciones de violencia por la defensa ambiental. Por otro lado, que las políticas nacionales y también todas las negociaciones en los organismos internacionales deben adoptar medidas afirmativas que estén a tono con los estándares de derechos humanos, y por eso es tan importante también que en el marco posterior a 2020 se incorpore esta perspectiva de derechos humanos, en donde la mujer pues tenga garantizado su derecho a acceder a la tierra, a la justicia, a la participación y todos los derechos pues que están reconocidos. Y pues como cuarto punto que es muy importante pues que todos los organismos implicados con la diversidad biológica garanticen y también faciliten el papel de la mujer y de la mujer indígena especialmente en todas las negociaciones sobre diversidad y también en la implementación de estos nuevos marcos, como por ejemplo en los planes y también en las evaluaciones para que se haga efectiva la participación y podamos ir avanzando en esta materia. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchas gracias por estar atentos al video de Edith. Compartiremos el video posteriormente a la reunión para que puedan acceder a él en caso de que estén interesados. Le damos ahora la bienvenida a Fanny, quien nos hablará sobre su experiencia en la aproximación de la incorporación del rol de las mujeres en la conservación de la biodiversidad desde la Amazonía colombiana. Fanny, bienvenida y muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos en este espacio.
Muy buenos días para todas que nos acompañan en este espacio y gracias por la invitación y también gracias a las compañeras que me antecedieron con unos conocimientos muy valiosos que siempre ayuda a que nuestro canasto de conocimiento sea más grande cada día. Bueno, como mujer indígena Huitoto de la Amazonía colombiana, quiero empezar reconociendo el rol de las mujeres bosquecinas, mujeres que dependemos de la selva, de los ríos, de las plantas, de la medicina tradicional, de todo lo que nos ofrece la naturaleza en nuestros territorios. Reconocer a ellas porque realmente las que están en territorio son las verdaderas cuidadoras de la biodiversidad. Ellas hacen no solamente la conservación, la protección, sino el uso respetuoso de los recursos de la biodiversidad. Desde la cosmovisión nuestra como pueblo Huitoto, siempre hablamos de que somos parte de esa biodiversidad, que la mujer es biodiversidad también. La mujer a las mujeres nos enseñan desde niñas, desde que somos pequeñas, nos recorren en el territorio para que conozcamos lo que tenemos en el territorio, árboles, animales, todo. Entonces, a cada ser, plantas, animales, nos enseñan los nombres. Eso con el fin de que lo protejamos, de que lo cuidemos para que no sea solamente para que nos sirva de alimentos en un momento dado, sino que también trabajamos de una manera hermanada con el territorio, con los recursos naturales. Nunca se manejan los recursos naturales de manera, digamos, depredada, sino que siempre es un uso respetuoso. Creo que eso va más allá de la sostenibilidad de un recurso natural. Es el uso respetuoso de los recursos naturales. ¿Por qué? Porque hay un diálogo con el territorio, hay un diálogo con los seres que hay en la naturaleza. Entonces, nos enseñan a que tenemos que respetarnos, que tenemos que ser recíprocos. De ahí viene es que las mujeres amazónicas sean unas mujeres que cumplen unos roles importantes en la restauración del territorio, en la reforestación de las especies de la fauna y también de la flora. Entonces, es este relacionamiento que no se reconoce. Siempre hablamos de sostenibilidad y bueno, en términos de política, ¿no? La sostenibilidad de la biodiversidad, pero la verdad es aquí el uso respetuoso. Esa es la parte que nos falta a nosotros tener en cuenta en nuestros diálogos. Y pues también enseñar a la otra sociedad que somos uno con la naturaleza, con el territorio. De ahí la importancia de que nosotros, para mantener esa hermandad con el territorio, con los recursos que tenemos, hagamos las ceremonias rituales para apaciguar, ¿no? Muchas veces hay energías también negativas, opuestas, que tenemos que regular y armonizar. Entonces es una vivencia armónica que hay en las comunidades indígenas, sobre todo de la Amazonía. Entonces, necesitamos de esa biodiversidad silvestre también. Domesticamos la biodiversidad también. Entonces hay especies domesticadas que también nos sirven en un momento dado para la medicina tradicional, para la alimentación, la gastronomía propia de nosotros como pueblos indígenas. Dependemos de la biodiversidad para nuestro sistema alimentario. La gobernanza territorial se hace siempre en términos de paridad. Hoy nosotros como mujeres de la Amazonía, de la cuenca amazónica y de la Amazonía colombiana, estamos hablando en términos de paridad. Ya no queremos hablar igualdad de género porque eso ya es un discurso que está relegado, como que no lo quieren entender. Entonces vamos a hablar nosotros en términos de paridad, hombre-mujer, mujer-hombre, pero en términos de paridad, porque la igualdad la están desconociendo, es una palabra que creo que ya está muy generalizado y pues lo dejan pasar como si nada no fuera importante. Entonces no queremos hablar ya de igualdad, sino de paridad, paridad en la participación, paridad en el goce efectivo de los derechos. De ahí que no se le puede relegar a las mujeres al momento de discusiones, debates, toma de decisiones sobre nuestros territorios, sobre nuestros recursos naturales y sobre la biodiversidad que hay en nuestros territorios. Tenemos que participar en términos de paridad. Esa es una lucha que estamos dando las mujeres de la cuenca amazónica y de la Amazonía colombiana, empezar a participar en los espacios de toma de decisiones, además también a gozar de los beneficios que nos oferta la naturaleza. Entonces, hoy la Amazonía está haciendo un ejercicio para alcanzar esa participación paritaria en los espacios de toma de decisiones. Decimos siempre que si no hay paridad, no hay vida. No hay cuidado de la vida si no hay paridad. Si hay paridad, podemos cuidar la vida en todas sus formas y manifestaciones. Como mujeres no podemos seguir siendo solo números, sino también nosotras somos actoras políticas en la toma de decisiones. Somos actoras de cambio y por lo tanto debemos estar en todos los espacios de toma de decisiones. Siempre que hablamos de protección, de conservación ambiental y territorial, mostramos siempre el rostro de la mujer. Por eso, hoy también en la Amazonía estamos diciendo que la conservación, la protección de la Amazonía tiene rostro de mujer, de esa mujer indígena amazónica que a través de los conocimientos ancestrales y tradicionales mantienen vivo la Amazonía, porque la Amazonía también necesita estar viva para que nosotros podamos estar vivos. Entonces las mujeres amazónicas, por principios y leyes de origen, tenemos el rol de cuidadoras, de restauradoras, de polinizadoras también. No solamente las abejas polinizan, sino también nosotras cuando recorremos los territorios y dejamos semillas por todos lados, estamos polinizando los territorios y la Amazonía y por lo tanto estamos garantizando la biodiversidad silvestre o también la biodiversidad cultivada. Entonces, es una tarea que hasta el momento no se ha reconocido y ojalá desde la voz de nosotras como mujeres, ese rol sea visibilizado, sea reconocido en todos los escenarios de discusiones ambientales, de biodiversidad y de todos los temas que hoy es, digamos, HIC en los espacios internacionales. Necesitamos seguir reconociendo la aportación o contribución que hacen las mujeres para no degradar los ecosistemas y sobre todo para nosotros, para la protección, el cuidado de la Amazonía y para que la biodiversidad rica que tenemos en la Amazonía no desaparezca. Y nuevamente digo, y por lo mismo también deben ser beneficiadas en términos de paridad cuando haya beneficios por el cuidado y la protección de la biodiversidad. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Fanny, por tu intervención y por recordarnos la relevancia del rol de las mujeres en la Amazonía colombiana en pro de la conservación de nuestra biodiversidad. Adelante y muchísimas gracias.
That was wonderful. Thank you to our speakers from Colombia. And now I'm delighted to introduce Maria Eugenia, who joins us on behalf of the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network to present on the critical role of Indigenous women's knowledge and the co-production of knowledge. So Maria Eugenia, bienvenido.
Nairaqata ma sumaruntawi taqichuiman pihilatanaqa kullakanak. Muy buenos días, buenas tardes y muchas gracias por la invitación para este evento de vital importancia por cuanto la biodiversidad es la humanidad, ¿no? Vamos a ir ya con el primer slide, por favor. La humanidad depende de la biodiversidad. Esto es esencial para el desarrollo sostenible del ecosistema. Todos dependemos de la biodiversidad. Y en el marco de lo que es la biodiversidad, fundamentalmente está lo que son los conocimientos tradicionales. El conocimiento tradicional es la biodiversidad. Está ligado muy estrecho a la razón de ser de los pueblos indígenas, desde el conocimiento tradicional mirado hacia la biodiversidad, tiene que ver con distintos temas, espacios, ecosistemas, ¿no? En el marco siempre de una visión integral y holística. El conocimiento tradicional es parte de lo que implica también el idioma, la cultura, la memoria, las prácticas tradicionales, los cuentos y los mitos. Si podemos ir la próxima, por favor. En ese sentido es que el valor del conocimiento tradicional es importante porque está ligado a lo que es este valor intrínseco de los pueblos indígenas. Por favor, si podemos ir al próximo slide. Los conocimientos tradicionales dentro de todo este espacio tiene aquello que es el valor potencial de los conocimientos tradicionales. Este valor potencial recae en lo que son los saberes, recae en lo que la identidad, la cultura, el idioma, la forma de producción, la forma de ser, de pensar y de sentir, recae en aquello que es la biodiversidad, muy ligado a los conocimientos tradicionales. Es por ello que en este marco, a lo largo del proceso de la Red de Mujeres Indígenas sobre Biodiversidad de América Latina y el Caribe, primero que es un grupo colectivo que agrupa distintos países desde las organizaciones locales, nacionales, regionales e internacional. La red tiene su vigencia desde 1998, prácticamente el 2000, con objetivos específicos de aprender aquello que es el valor del conocimiento tradicional. La Red de Mujeres Indígenas ha estado trabajando y está trabajando muy fuertemente en la construcción, la protección, la revitalización y la innovación de los conocimientos tradicionales. Para ello hemos realizado muchos talleres a nivel nacional en distintos países. Se ha conformado las instancias de organizaciones locales con un fuerte arraigo de lo que es preservar los conocimientos tradicionales, trabajar, incentivar, investigar en el tema de los conocimientos tradicionales. Estos talleres locales que hicimos, talleres nacionales que hicimos, nos ha llevado a unir agendas como mujeres indígenas. Hemos tenido una fuerte incidencia, por ejemplo, en el plan de género. Nos gustaría, siempre como mujeres, hemos querido de que el tema de género sea vista desde una visión, enfoque de lo que es este tema de género. porque cada cultura tiene su forma de recrear la participación de hombres y mujeres. Y en esto, en cuanto a lo que es estas estrategias de trabajo, ha estado ligado en el tema de lo que son otros espacios internacionales, y ahí voy a las estrategias, con otras redes también internacionales y nacionales, pero siempre la mirada ha estado en qué incentivar la participación de las mujeres en los distintos espacios, enfocado a lo que es motivar a que exista un diálogo entre las mujeres titulares de los conocimientos, mujeres mayores, con la juventud. Porque la transmisión del conocimiento tradicional se hace en la práctica, se hace en la vida diaria, se hace viendo a los mayores cómo producen, cómo interpretan, por ejemplo, los ecosistemas, cómo viven en los ecosistemas, esta diversidad de los ecosistemas. Y en ese marco, con el IPBES, pues hemos tenido un marco de alianza, de trabajo y de coordinación para enfatizar el tema de conocimientos tradicionales y fortalecer esta participación de las mujeres. También hemos seguido muy de cerca y todos los procesos de lo que ha sido el convenio de biodiversidad, pero desde una instancia de lo que es los contextos nacionales y los espacios locales. En ese sentido, esta creación de alianzas nos ha llevado también a otros espacios como el cambio climático, el foro permanente para cuestiones indígenas, vuelvo a reiterar lo que es el IPBES, instancias también de consolidación. Yo creo que la región de América Latina y el Caribe es la única región que tiene consolidada, por ejemplo, el Foro Internacional Indígena. En el Foro Internacional Indígena coincidimos cinco, vamos a decir, organizaciones regionales, como la CAOI de la parte andina, la COICA en la parte amazónica, ECBIA de las mujeres, la Red de Mujeres Indígenas sobre Biodiversidad, y también SICA y CIMA de la parte de lo que es Mesoamérica. Entonces, el trabajo de visibilización de la red es importante por cuanto nos permite no solamente a las mujeres quienes estamos en este proceso, sino también la mirada siempre a las mujeres de base local, porque ellas son que pues a diario están con lo que es, diremos, la práctica tradicional en nuestras comunidades, ¿no? El cuidado del animal, el cuidado del sembradío, la predicción, diremos, del clima, la predicción de la biodiversidad, la relación con la biodiversidad. Entonces, por eso es que el trabajo de sensibilización para nosotros es importante, no solamente como mujeres indígenas, sino como mujeres en general, como sociedad en general. Entonces, este proceso de lo que son, bueno, las áreas de trabajo son distintos. Por ejemplo, desde el proceso de comunicación en idioma, tratamos de que el proceso de comunicación, los talleres vayan en idioma local, el seguimiento al CBD, a cambio climático, a IPBES, el seguimiento inclusive a las cuestiones pues de lengua e idiomas. Para nosotros es importante porque la biodiversidad tiene que ver con lo que es el fortalecimiento de la identidad, el fortalecimiento del idioma. Entonces, esto va, diremos, en el marco de lo que se pierde, la biodiversidad se pierde en un idioma. Podemos ir la próxima, por favor. Y es que en ese marco es importante el reconocimiento de la titularidad de los conocimientos tradicionales. También en este marco es importante lo que es pues los ecosistemas, la diversidad de los ecosistemas. Justamente entre el día 16 y 17 hemos tenido esta reunión de debate en el marco de lo que es Red Plus, por ejemplo, de cómo es que los conocimientos tradicionales deben ser el sustento para entender estos temas y entrar en un trabajo comprometido también de lo que implica la recuperación del conocimiento tradicional. En ese marco también está el estudio de desde instancias nacionales, como en Bolivia, el estudio de lo que viene a ser especies silvestres, ¿no? Las especies silvestres en este marco implica también nuevamente volver a mirar porque muchos conocimientos se están perdiendo por el carácter colonial, a veces por el carácter de políticas públicas de las partes, también se va perdiendo por efectos de la migración de los pueblos, la visión también de cómo se mira estos conocimientos tradicionales en algo de lo que es retrógrado, como que pues es del pasado, ¿no? Los conocimientos son tan innovadores, diremos, y son tan actuales porque el cambio climático es un proceso, diremos, que a diario lo enfrentamos y los conocimientos tradicionales van a la par de eso. Entonces, cuando hablamos de desarrollo sostenible, sustentable, tiene que estar en este marco, pero siempre desde una mirada, diremos, de la mirada de los conocimientos tradicionales. Decía en esta, aún falta trabajar, por ejemplo, el tema de especies silvestres, en el caso, por ejemplo, de la vicuña, siendo un animal silvestre, sin embargo, la lana pues es altamente, diremos, altamente carísima, de mercado internacional. Las formas de cómo se esquilaban, diremos, con la participación de las mujeres, porque son las mujeres que en el cotidiano vivir están pues en relación, diremos, con los animales, con la producción, con el conocimiento, con la familia, con la comunidad. Por eso es que es tan importante incentivar esta mirada de las mujeres indígenas, la participación desde esos espacios locales, nacionales, internacionales, desde un enfoque propio basado en la investigación, en la reflexión y por lo tanto en una cooperación internacional también que nos permita establecer diálogos consensuados. Tenemos a la mira muchos eventos en pie, está el de cambio climático, está lo que es la preparación del convenio de diversidad biológica, estamos trabajando en el tema de los conocimientos, la participación de las mujeres indígenas, porque hemos sido, diremos, coadyuvadoras de los procesos muy importantes en el CBD, como el protocolo de Nagoya, el tema del grupo de trabajo sobre conocimientos tradicionales y ahora el plan de acción que nuevamente nos obliga a mirar desde un enfoque muy propio, desde una mirada colectiva, desde una declaración colectiva de sentimiento profundo de las mujeres indígenas. Muchas gracias. Hayaya.
Muchas gracias, Maria Eugenia, and to our wonderful lineup of speakers today. We're delighted to have had you on our panel and to share in all of your rich presentations. I think there have been so many critical messages to share today that unfortunately we have in fact run out of time for the question and answer session. But I'd like to encourage anybody who does have any questions to submit your questions to the assessment email on behalf of the NEA initiative, which my colleague will share again in the chat. And we'll coordinate responses to any questions you have. So thanks so much for staying on. I know it's run a little bit over. And just a final few words to say this event was made possible thanks to the generous support of the International Climate Initiative of the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety of the Federal Republic of Germany. UNEP WCMC hosts the Secretariat for the Subglobal Assessment Network and the National Ecosystem Assessment Initiative as part of a consortium with UNDP and UNESCO through the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service Network. Before we go, we'd like to also encourage you once again to join the Subglobal Assessment Network so you can keep up to date with our upcoming events, and the link is in the chat. Thank you once again to our fabulous speakers today and to our audience. I was so thrilled to see the diversity of people who've joined today's event from around the world, and we really look forward to hosting you at events again in the future. So all the very best to everybody, and let's keep in touch.